What would you do if someone you loved, someone you trusted, slid a document across the table and asked you to agree to something so strange, so calculated, that even your closest friends said, "Man, something isn't right here"? Because that's exactly what Trevor Engelson, Meghan Markle's ex-husband, now claims happened long before the world knew her name, long before the royal wedding, long before titles, fame, and Netflix deals ever entered the picture. And the wildest part? He says he didn't realize what that document really meant until years later, when it was far too late to undo any of it. That moment, according to people who were there, changed the entire direction of their relationship, and it set the stage for a story that would explode years later in ways nobody saw coming. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about that for a second. Imagine being in love, thinking your relationship is growing, imagining a future with someone you believe is on your team, only to be blindsided by a sudden demand that feels more like a business negotiation than a partnership. A demand you can't explain. A demand that doesn't match the person you thought you knew. That's the kind of emotional whiplash Trevor reportedly faced, and it's the spark that ignited everything we're about to get into today. And honestly, the question practically screams at you. Why would someone ask for an agreement like that before marriage? What were they trying to protect? What were they trying to control? Or better yet, who were they afraid of becoming? And here's the part people don't talk about enough. Trevor didn't say a single word about any of this for years. Not when Meghan married Prince Harry. Not when she became the Duchess of Sussex. Not when she did Oprah. Not when she launched podcasts, book deals, documentaries, or spoke about her past relationships in coded but unmistakable ways. Through all of it, Trevor stayed silent. Completely. Not a single quote. Not a single interview. Not a single public comment. Even when the narrative around Meghan's past was being shaped or rewritten without him. But silence is not the same thing as peace. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes silence is pressure. And sometimes silence is the thing that cracks just before the truth finally breaks open. And according to insiders close to Trevor, that's exactly what's happening now. So why now? Why break the silence at this moment? What pushed him to speak after years of refusing to engage? And how did this mysterious, controlling pre-marriage agreement become the center of the story? This isn't just about a divorce. This isn't just about an ex speaking out. This is about a pattern. A pattern that Meghan's friends, co-workers, assistants, producers, and even royal insiders later on claim they noticed in different ways. A pattern that starts small, almost invisible, but becomes clearer the more you hear from people who experienced it firsthand. Because the truth is, Meghan didn't become who we know her as today overnight. There's a whole version of Meghan from her early Hollywood years that the general public has never truly seen. A version long before the royal spotlight, long before Suits became a hit, long before the glamour, the curated image, the global interviews. Back when she was still just another actress trying to make it in a cutthroat industry, writing calligraphy on the side, hustling for roles, balancing auditions, and building connections. Back when Trevor wasn't just a partner. He was the one person who believed in her more than anyone else. And yet, even during those early days, something was shifting beneath the surface. Something subtle, something controlled, something calculated. And friends of both Trevor and Meghan say that those shifts became more obvious when she allegedly introduced this strange, unsettling agreement. The agreement Trevor now says he regrets ever touching. Now, let's be honest. Plenty of celebrity couples use agreements, prenups, NDAs. All of that is normal. Hollywood is full of people protecting their careers, their assets, their reputations. But what makes this story different? What makes this agreement so shocking is not that it existed, but what it allegedly contained. The motivations, the tone, the implications, the timing, the emotional cost, and the way it seemed to foreshadow the end of the marriage before the marriage even began. Because according to people in Trevor's circle, one thing became very clear. Meghan did not want a traditional partnership. She wanted structure. She wanted control. She wanted the ability to shape the narrative. Even back then, long before The Crown, long before the world was watching. And this document, this mysterious agreement, was the blueprint for exactly that. But here's the twist, the one that makes your stomach drop. Trevor didn't realize what this document meant at the time. He didn't piece together the signs. He didn't understand the power of the choice he was making. He signed it out of love, out of trust, out of wanting the relationship to work. And the people closest to him now say that if he had truly understood the emotional consequences of what he was agreeing to, he never would have touched that paper. This is the moment where everything begins. And if you're sitting here thinking, why would someone ask for such a thing before marriage? You're not alone. The people who were closest to this story asked the same question. They still ask it today. They still wonder what Meghan's long-term plan was. They still talk about the day she presented the agreement, the shift in her behavior, the emotional detachment, the subtle power dynamics that came with it. And they still talk about the part of the agreement that ended up being the most shocking, the part that didn't become clear until much, much later. Here's a detail that almost nobody knows. The reason this story matters right now is because new information has resurfaced. Information about Meghan's early relationship patterns, about how she managed her image, about how she approached major life transitions. Hollywood insiders, former assistants, producers, people from the Suits era, people from Trevor's life, even individuals who later worked around the royal family, they've all begun comparing notes. And guess what? The same themes keep popping up over and over again. Control, image, narrative management, strategic positioning, emotional compartmentalization, calculated distance, and, in rare moments, chilling precision. The controlling agreement Trevor now talks about appears to be an early example, maybe even the first example, of behaviors that would later reappear in Meghan's most high-stakes relationships and environments. When you hear these accounts side by side, the similarities are impossible to ignore. And that's why this story hits harder now than ever before. Trevor didn't just experience heartbreak. He experienced confusion. He experienced guilt. He experienced the emotional aftermath of feeling like he signed away something he should have protected, not because of the legal details, but because of what it represented emotionally. He felt blindsided. He felt manipulated. He felt misled. And he felt used as a stepping stone. A stepping stone he didn't know he was standing on until it crumbled beneath him. And for years, he kept all of that inside. He refused interview requests. He refused to gossip. He refused to give quotes. He refused to retaliate. He rebuilt his life quietly. He moved on. He got married again. He had children. He found peace. He did everything you're supposed to do when you close a painful chapter. But pain doesn't disappear just because you stop talking about it. And love doesn't vanish from your memory just because the person who once shared it with you walked away without explanation. So why is Trevor speaking now? Why is this story resurfacing? What changed? According to insiders, Trevor didn't want to speak, not at first. But a combination of resurfaced documents, renewed media interest, and certain behind-the-scenes conversations made him realize that staying silent was no longer protecting anyone. In fact, some argue that staying quiet only made the narrative more distorted and more unfair to the truth. And then came the revelation that broke the dam. When Trevor learned what Meghan allegedly did with the agreement after the divorce, what she allegedly had prepared, what she allegedly planned, and what she allegedly didn't tell him, ever, that's when everything snapped. And today, for the first time, Trevor is letting the world see the part of the story he never wanted to share. The part that explains his silence. The part that explains the emotional weight. The part that explains why his friends say this wasn't just a breakup. It was a psychological turning point. A revelation that changed the way he sees his past. A revelation that changed how he understands the woman he once thought he would spend forever with. And the ironic twist? The part he regrets most isn't the breakup. It isn't the fame. It isn't the royal wedding. It isn't Meghan's reinvention. It isn't even the way he was written out of the narrative. The part he regrets most is the moment he ignored his own instincts. The moment he signed something he didn't understand, simply because he trusted someone he believed loved him. But here's where things get even more explosive. Because while the agreement itself was shocking, the real twist came later. Something Trevor didn't expect. Something he didn't learn until after Meghan married into the royal family. Something that puts every decision she made in a new light. Something that takes this entire story from a Hollywood divorce to a full-blown psychological mystery. And that is exactly where our story turns next. Because what Trevor discovered, long after the ink was dry, long after Meghan had moved on, long after the entire world began embracing her as a royal, didn't just shock him. It changed everything. What if silence isn't peace? What if silence is pressure, building over years, until it becomes too heavy to carry alone? That's the provocative question that slams open the beginning of Trevor's story, because the truth is simple. Nobody expected him to speak. Not after the divorce. Not after Meghan's rise. Not after the royal wedding that turned her into global royalty overnight. And certainly not after the explosive interviews, the streaming deals, the documentaries, the podcasts, the speeches, and the polished new version of her past that seemed to wipe him out of the story completely. But here we are, hearing whispers, leaks, accounts from sources close to him, and every single one hints at the same thing. Trevor didn't break his silence because he wanted attention. He didn't speak because he wanted revenge. He didn't speak because he missed her. He spoke because something finally shifted. Something that made his silence impossible to maintain. Something that forced him to revisit the part of his life he spent years trying to forget. Something tied directly to the agreement Meghan allegedly pushed for, long before either of them knew what their future would look like. Imagine spending years watching the world discuss someone you once loved, someone you once lived with, someone you once supported emotionally, financially, spiritually, professionally, watching her story be retold in interviews, magazines, documentaries, podcasts. Imagine hearing the global public talk about her difficult childhood, her struggles, her ambition, her relationships, her path to fame, her courage, her reinvention. Imagine hearing people praise her for rebuilding her life after toxic relationships, after unsupportive partners, after men who held her back. And imagine being one of those men. Even though you know the truth is far more complicated, far more human, far more painful. What would you do? Would you stay quiet? Would you let the world believe whatever narrative they found the most glamorous or inspiring? Would you let people fill in the blanks about your role in her life? Even if those blanks weren't accurate at all. But here's the twist. For a long time, Trevor did exactly that. He chose quiet. He chose dignity. He chose distance. While Meghan built a global brand on reinvention, Trevor built a private life far away from the headlines. While Meghan became a duchess, Trevor became a husband again, a father, a man with a new life that had nothing to do with the woman he married when they were young and still figuring themselves out. He stayed silent even when tabloids came knocking, even when reporters offered him money, even when talk shows hinted they wanted him as a guest, even when his friends told him, "Dude, you should say something, because people think they know what happened, but they don't." Still, he kept his mouth shut. Still, he protected the past. Still, he chose not to engage, even when he knew he could have. But here's where things get interesting. Silence is not always a calm sea. Sometimes silence is a dam that cracks slowly, quietly, invisibly over time. Then one day, a final drop hits, the final bit of pressure builds, and the entire dam bursts open. Those close to Trevor say that this moment didn't come from anger. It didn't come from jealousy. It didn't come from resentment. It came from something else entirely, truth. Or rather, the distortion of truth. Because the more Meghan retold her story, the more she reshaped her narrative. The more Trevor became a ghost, an unfinished sentence, a blurry sketch of a man who no longer resembled the person he actually was in that relationship. And then there was the agreement, the strange, unsettling document Meghan allegedly asked him to sign before their marriage. A document he kept private for years. A document he didn't want to talk about because he didn't want to embarrass anyone. A document he didn't fully understand at the time. And a document whose meaning only clicked into place when new information surfaced years later. That's when Trevor realized that silence wasn't protecting the truth anymore. It was burying it. But you might be wondering, what changed? Why now? Why after all these years would he finally allow himself to speak about something he had buried deep? And the answer, according to those closest to him, is both simple and heartbreaking. Trevor didn't break his silence because he wanted to attack Meghan. He broke it because he wanted to reclaim himself. To reclaim the dignity stripped away by a narrative that painted him as a footnote. To reclaim the part of his life that didn't belong to the public yet had been rewritten by the public anyway. And to reclaim the truth about how things really unfolded behind the scenes. Not the polished version told on TV, but the version lived in private, behind closed doors, when cameras weren't rolling. Here's an emotional angle many people never considered. Trevor was there before the spotlight, before the fame, before suits, before the palace, before everything. He knew Meghan when she was still climbing, still hustling, still figuring out who she wanted to be. He supported her dreams. He drove her to auditions. He helped pay the bills. He believed in her talent. He believed in her potential. And for years, that bond meant something real. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't a PR relationship. This wasn't a stepping stone. This was someone he genuinely loved, someone he fully expected to build a future with. And that's what makes his eventual realization so painful. Because when Trevor finally looked back at the agreement, that document he once dismissed as quirky, maybe unnecessary, maybe harmless, he realized something chilling. It wasn't harmless at all. It was a blueprint that made more sense in hindsight than it ever did in the moment. A blueprint that aligned with many behaviors people later described from Meghan's royal years. A blueprint that hinted at a long-term pattern of protecting herself before anyone else, even the person she claimed to love. And that is the detail that reportedly sparked Trevor's decision to speak. Not bitterness, not revenge, but clarity. But let's take it back for a moment. Picture Trevor in the earliest days after the divorce. Hurt, confused, blindsided. Meghan had ended the marriage quickly, some say abruptly, leaving him reeling. Some say she mailed the engagement ring back in a box. Others say she became cold and distant long before the breakup. Regardless of which account you believe, the emotional truth is the same. Trevor was devastated. Friends describe him as a man walking through fog. Not angry, not vengeful, just broken. And he stayed that way for a while. But eventually, like anyone who goes through heartbreak, he began to heal. He rebuilt his life. He found new love. He remarried. He had children. He moved forward. What he didn't do, what he refused to do, was speak. Then time passed. Meghan married into the royal family. The world's perception of her changed overnight. Her past became a storyline. Her previous marriage became a footnote. Trevor became an ex, and nothing more. But even then, he stayed silent. Even as narratives drifted far from his lived experience, he stayed silent. Even as his role in her life was minimized, misunderstood, mischaracterized, he stayed silent. But something shifted when new information began resurfacing, when old documents, old conversations, old red flags suddenly clicked into place. When people who once stayed quiet started sharing their own memories, their own experiences, their own interpretations of how Meghan handled relationships, negotiations, agreements, and transitions. When Hollywood insiders compared notes with people in the royal circle and realized the pattern was impossible to ignore, that's when everything snapped into focus. That's when Trevor understood the significance of the agreement. That's when he saw exactly what he had been part of, even if he didn't recognize it at the time. Imagine realizing years later that a decision you made out of love wasn't based on love at all. Imagine realizing that something you thought was harmless was anything but. Imagine discovering that the agreement you signed was not a quirky request, but the first red flag in a long chain of similar behaviors. Imagine discovering that your silence, meant to keep peace, had allowed an entire narrative to form that erased you completely. That's what insiders say happened to Trevor. And once that realization hit him, silence became impossible. But again, let's pause for a direct question to you, the viewer. What would you do if you discovered years later that something you once accepted in good faith was actually the beginning of a pattern you couldn't see at the time? Would you stay silent? Would you protect someone who no longer protected the truth about your shared past? Or would you finally speak? Because that's where Trevor found himself, standing at the crossroads between silence and honesty. And for the first time, he chose honesty. Not because he wanted drama, not because he wanted attention, but because he wanted closure, real closure. Closure based on truth, not speculation. Closure based on what actually happened, not the rose-colored version served to millions through screens. And that is why this moment matters. That is why his voice now carries weight. That is why people are listening. And that is why this story is exploding across Hollywood and beyond. Because for years, there was one question everyone asked but no one could answer. Why did Meghan want that agreement in the first place? And now, for the first time, Trevor is ready to tell the world what he believes the answer really is. But what he's about to reveal next is even more shocking. Have you ever looked back at a past relationship and realized that the person you remembered never truly existed the way you thought they did? That the version of them you fell in love with was real, yes, but also incomplete, missing edges, missing context, missing the deeper truth hiding beneath the charm? That's the exact emotional crossroads Trevor Engelson found himself standing at years after his marriage to Meghan Markle ended. Because the early romance, the warm, glowing, picture-perfect chapter everyone assumes they had, looks very different when you strip away nostalgia and examine what was actually happening beneath the surface. And in this chapter, we're going back to the beginning, back to a time before the tabloids, before the palace, before the global headlines, back to when Trevor and Meghan were simply two hustling Hollywood strivers trying to make sense of their careers, their lives, and each other. But here's the twist. When you zoom out, their early romance looks almost nothing like the polished, sweet first marriage narrative people like to imagine. In fact, the more you listen to people who were around back then, assistants, friends, producers, castmates, the more you realize there were subtle signals, tiny cracks, faint warning signs that didn't look like much at the time, but paint an entirely different picture today. And that's where our story begins. At the intersection of youthful love and rising ambition, in a world where affection existed, yes, but so did a quiet undercurrent of strategy that Trevor was too in love to notice. Picture it. Los Angeles, early 2000s. Meghan was still grinding, doing auditions, hustling for roles, working side gigs, paying for acting classes, trying to get noticed in a city bursting with people who looked just like her, sounded like her, dreamed like her. Trevor, on the other hand, was already finding his place in the producing world, not a blockbuster mogul yet, not a household name, but definitely someone with industry credibility, connections, and a growing reputation. When their paths crossed, it wasn't a thunderbolt moment, not a dramatic Hollywood kiss in the rain. It was slow, natural, the kind of connection that grows from shared struggle, shared ambition, shared long nights, shared laughs, shared doubts. They were both dreamers in a city that devours dreamers, and that gave them a bond many couples don't get the privilege of having. Friends who were around in those days say Trevor was smitten, fully committed, incredibly supportive. He believed in Meghan's potential. He saw her talent. He saw her drive. He saw the fire inside her that made her different from most actresses trying to break in. She had that hunger, one Hollywood acquaintance later said. She wasn't waiting to be discovered. She was actively building herself, piece by piece. And Trevor loved that about her. Loved her ambition. Loved her independence. Loved her focus. To him, it made her glow differently. To him, her determination wasn't a warning sign. It was an asset. It made him proud. But here's the contradiction. The very trait that Trevor admired would eventually become the trait that dismantled everything. Ambition is a beautiful thing until it becomes the lens through which every decision is filtered. Ambition is empowering until the people around you become stepping stones, consciously or unconsciously. Ambition is magnetic until it becomes directional, pulling one partner forward while dragging the other behind. And that transition, subtle at first, began earlier than anyone realized. Let's talk about the early days of their relationship. The dinners, the small apartments, the late-night conversations about dreams, the shared frustrations about casting directors who didn't call back, the joy when a gig finally landed, the fear of being forgotten in a city of millions. These were real moments. These were raw, human, honest, vulnerable moments that formed the foundation of their relationship. Meghan confided in Trevor about the roles she desperately wanted, the obstacles she faced, the pressure she felt to succeed. Trevor confided in her about the stress of producing, the insecurity of Hollywood financing, the roller coaster of choosing projects. They were two people trying to build futures that didn't exist yet. And that's what makes the next part so heartbreaking. Because while Trevor remembers this period as warm, loving, full of laughter, full of shared meals, full of encouragement, some of Meghan's friends remember observing something different. A woman who loved Trevor, yes, but also a woman who understood his usefulness. A woman who recognized that Trevor wasn't just a boyfriend. He was a doorway. A doorway into rooms she wanted to enter. A doorway into opportunities she couldn't create alone. a doorway into a version of her future that felt faster, bigger, more attainable with the right partner. Now, let's be clear. This doesn't mean her affection wasn't real. People can love someone and still be strategic. People can care about someone and still see them as a resource. People can build genuine memories with someone they also view as temporary. That's the contradiction at the heart of this chapter. And it's the contradiction that Trevor would only begin to understand years later. Because during those early days, Trevor was in deep. He introduced Meghan to people in his network. He used his connections to support her career. He vouched for her. He helped her navigate the chaotic, often unfair world of Hollywood casting. He believed in her potential so fiercely that he would often talk about her to industry contacts, pushing her name just a little further into the room. And Meghan accepted this support. Gracefully at times, calculatedly at others, according to certain friends who observed the dynamic more closely than Trevor realized. One former acquaintance, speaking years after the divorce, put it this way: Meghan always had a plan. Always. She knew how to move, how to position herself, how to speak in a way that impressed the right people. Trevor thought he was supporting her dreams, and he was, but he didn't see that she was mapping out her upward trajectory with every decision she made. But here's the question I want you to consider. How many relationships begin this way? How many couples build something meaningful even when ambition is quietly threading itself through the foundation? How many people fall in love with someone whose goals are bigger than their ability to stay still? Is it wrong? Is it manipulative? Or is it simply human? It's complicated. It's nuanced. And it's the nuance that makes Trevor's early memories so emotionally charged in hindsight. Because even though Meghan was affectionate, even though she was attentive, even though she and Trevor shared real moments, some friends noticed something else. She always stayed slightly detached, slightly ahead, slightly forward-facing, slightly strategic. She wanted to succeed. She wanted to rise. She wanted more, always more. And in her mind, according to those who knew her well, rising meant shedding anything that didn't fit her vision of her future. But back then, Trevor didn't see any of this. He wasn't looking for red flags. He wasn't analyzing her intentions. He wasn't doubting her love. He was young, in love, building his career, and thrilled to be supporting a woman he believed in deeply. And Meghan knew how to play that role. The warm partner, the supportive girlfriend, the driven actress who appreciated everything he did for her. She was charming. She was kind. She was determined. She was confident. And Trevor ate it up. Why wouldn't he? Love makes you blind. Ambition makes you busy. And together, those two forces can hide the cracks long enough for a relationship to grow roots, even if those roots aren't as deep as they appear. Let's fast forward to the period just before their engagement. By this point, Meghan had started gaining traction, not fame, not big roles yet, but momentum. Casting directors were remembering her. Producers were calling back. She was booked on briefcase number 24 on Deal or No Deal. She was building a small but rising resume. She was starting to believe she was on the cusp of something bigger. And that's when people close to them began noticing the earliest signs of tension. One friend of Trevor's said it this way: she wanted the future to move faster than Trevor could keep up with. Not his career, hers. She felt like she was finally gaining speed, and she didn't want anything slowing her down. Think about that. Let that sentence sit with you. Because momentum can be intoxicating. Momentum can make people impatient. Momentum can make someone look at their life and ask, what isn't supporting who I'm becoming? And unfortunately, it's around this time, according to multiple accounts, when Meghan allegedly began subtly redefining what she needed in a partner. More control, more structure, more predictability, more leverage. And suddenly, the warm, early romance took a strange turn. A transition so small Trevor barely noticed it happening, until the day she dropped the agreement on him. But we're not there yet. Not quite. Before we reach that explosive moment, we have to understand how the foundation slowly shifted. Because the truth is this: the early romance people imagine, the cute young couple, the cozy Hollywood life, the chasing dreams together fairy tale, isn't the full story. There was an underlying edge to their relationship that Trevor couldn't recognize back then, but every single person who has spoken about it since says the same thing. The woman Meghan was becoming wasn't the same woman Trevor fell in love with. And the agreement, the shocking, strange, controlling agreement she allegedly presented wasn't a random idea. It was the moment the mask slipped. Because what Trevor didn't know, what he couldn't have known, is that the woman sitting across the table from him that day wasn't asking for something harmless. She was setting the stage for what came next. And that next moment is the day that changed everything. What would you do if someone you loved, truly loved, suddenly asked you to sign something that felt off? Not dangerous, not abusive, not financially ruinous, but just wrong. Wrong in a way you couldn't articulate. Wrong in a way that your body understood before your brain did. Wrong in a way that made you pause, even if you didn't know why. That's the exact emotional punch Trevor Engelson reportedly experienced the moment Meghan slid that now infamous document across the table. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't framed as a test or a fight. It was quiet, silent, almost businesslike. And that silence is what made everything feel so much heavier. Picture the moment. They're sitting together. Maybe at home, maybe at a cafe, maybe somewhere neutral, somewhere that gave Meghan a sense of control. She reaches into her bag. She pulls out a folder. She places it on the table with an expression Trevor can't quite read. Not nervous, not apologetic, maybe even confident, maybe slightly detached, maybe already emotionally halfway out the door without him realizing it. And then she says something simple, calm, soft, straightforward. I need you to look at this. Not, we need to talk. Not, I want to make sure we're on the same page. Not, let's plan our future. Just, I need you to look at this. Cold, clean, clinical. That's the moment friends say Trevor felt the shift. A shift that didn't make sense at the time, but would haunt him years later. Because when Meghan opened that folder, according to multiple insiders, Trevor saw something he never expected to see from the woman he thought he was going to spend his life with. It wasn't a simple prenup. It wasn't a harmless promise. It wasn't even a traditional agreement about finances or property or future decisions. It was something stranger, something more personal, something that wasn't about money, but about control, about boundaries, about image, about narrative, about her. This wasn't a document created to protect them. This was a document created to protect her. And the question that sits like a stone in your stomach is this: protect her from what? Or maybe from whom? That's what Trevor couldn't figure out in the moment. He loved her. He trusted her. He believed she meant well. So when he first flipped through the pages, he tried to understand. He tried to rationalize it. He tried to make sense of why someone who claimed to love him would ask for something so unromantic, so sterile, so calculated. And like so many people who don't want to rock the boat, who don't want to appear insecure or suspicious, Trevor did what many partners do. He tried to pretend it was normal, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. One friend later described it perfectly. He looked like a guy who just realized he'd been invited into a room he didn't want to be in. But what was actually written in the agreement? That's the question that has obsessed people for years. While no one outside the inner circle has seen the exact document, insiders have described the general themes. And let me tell you, those themes paint a picture that makes your heart thump a little harder the more you hear. There were clauses about privacy, clauses about information control, clauses about communication boundaries, clauses about post-relationship expectations, and, according to one person familiar with the situation, clauses that felt less like a prenup and more like an NDA on steroids. Imagine being asked to agree to something like that before your wedding. Imagine the confusion, the emotional whiplash, the sense that the future you dreamed of together might not be the same future your partner envisions. Because these weren't clauses about protecting assets or defining financial independence. These were clauses about behavior, clauses about narrative control, clauses about what Trevor could say or do years down the line. Think about that. Really think about it. Before they were even married, Meghan wanted to ensure that if anything went wrong, she would still control the public story. That she could silence parts of the narrative. That she could manage optics. That she could guide public perception. That she could, essentially, pre-author the breakup before the marriage even began. Does that sound like love? Or does it sound like strategy? That's the emotional contradiction that punches hardest. Because according to those who knew Trevor back then, he wasn't thinking strategically. He wasn't planning ahead. He wasn't imagining failure. He was in love. Deeply. Honestly. Completely. And when you love someone like that, your mind automatically defaults to trust. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You assume their intentions are pure, even when the actions feel confusing. Trevor told friends he felt blindsided. Not betrayed, not yet, but blindsided. Surprised, uncertain, as if a door had suddenly closed between them and he didn't know why. He remembered thinking, where is this coming from? But he never said it out loud. He didn't want to seem dramatic. He didn't want to seem suspicious. He didn't want to ruin the moment by making it a fight. So instead, he asked her what the agreement was for. Calmly, gently, softly. And Meghan, in her typical, composed, carefully chosen tone, reassured him that it was nothing to worry about. Just something smart couples do. Something to protect both of us. Something to clarify boundaries. Nothing personal. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that should scare him. But those who were in Trevor's life back then remember something else. Meghan was very good at choosing the right words. Very good at smoothing over discomfort. Very good at presenting something emotional in a way that felt rational. Very good at making people feel like they were the ones being unreasonable for asking questions. And Trevor, in love, vulnerable, supportive, trusting, fell right into that tone. But here's the piece that really sets off alarm bells. Meghan allegedly refused to explain certain parts of the agreement. Not in detail, not in depth, not in the way you'd expect from a future spouse asking her partner to sign a legally binding document. She brushed off questions. She glossed over specifics. She minimized emotional impact. She reframed it as normal. But nothing about it was normal. One of Trevor's close friends reportedly said, "Dude, it felt like she was already planning her exit." And that's the line that makes your shoulders tense, because hindsight proves that friend wasn't wrong. But the strangest part, the part Trevor would only understand years later, wasn't the existence of the agreement. It was the tone. He said the tone didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like a presentation, as if Meghan had already decided what she wanted and was simply waiting for his signature. No negotiation, no discussion, no compromise, just expectation. A future duchess asking for royal-style control long before a tiara ever touched her head. And the part that left Trevor stunned, according to one insider, wasn't even the content. It was the emotional shift. The distance. The lack of warmth. The feeling that the woman sitting across from him wasn't his fiancée, but a professional delivering paperwork. That was the moment the romance flickered. The moment something broke. The moment Trevor realized the future might not look the way he imagined. But here's the heartbreaking twist. He signed anyway. Because he loved her. Because he trusted her. Because he believed her explanation. Because he didn't want to start a war. Because he didn't want to be that guy. Because he didn't want to ruin their relationship by questioning her motives. And Meghan, calm, relieved, composed, accepted his signature. But Trevor didn't know what he had just done. Not yet. Not then. Not until years later. When he discovered the real reason behind the agreement. And that reason would blow everything apart. Have you ever looked at a document years after signing it and realized, with a sinking feeling in your stomach, that you never understood what you were agreeing to in the first place? That you didn't read it with the right eyes, the right context, the right awareness? That you missed the subtext? That you missed the implications? That you missed the warning hidden between the lines? Because that's exactly the psychological avalanche Trevor Engelson was hit with when he finally learned. Long after the divorce, long after the world had crowned Meghan as a duchess, long after royal drama became headlines, what the real intention behind that strange, unsettling agreement had allegedly been. It didn't hit him all at once. It wasn't a single lightning bolt moment where everything snapped into place. It was slower, creeping, like peeling back wallpaper only to discover mold spreading underneath, invisible until it's too big to ignore. The realization grew piece by piece, story by story, observation by observation, confession by confession. And the more Trevor heard, the more he understood that the agreement wasn't random, wasn't quirky, wasn't harmless. It had a purpose he wasn't emotionally prepared to consider at the time he signed it. Let's break it down. Because according to those familiar with its contents, the agreement had 3 core pillars, 3 structural beams that shaped its entire foundation. And each of those pillars, when examined through the lens of hindsight, reveals a truth that Trevor himself has reportedly struggled to accept. The first pillar was control. Not financial control, not logistical control, but emotional and narrative control. Meghan allegedly wanted clear boundaries on what Trevor could say publicly about their relationship, not just in the present, but in the future. It wasn't just a "don't talk about our private life" clause. It was deeper. It outlined what kind of information he was allowed to share, what kind he wasn't, what conversations were off-limits, what topics could never be mentioned even if they separated. It was less of a safety net and more of a muzzle, a preemptive strike against future storytelling. Why would someone ask for that? Why would someone, at the very beginning of a marriage, want to control the story of how it might end? That question bothered Trevor for years. He brushed it off at first. Because love makes you rationalize. Love makes you excuse things that would terrify you if you weren't emotionally invested. But in hindsight, with distance, with perspective, he realized what others had seen from the beginning. Meghan didn't view the future as uncertain. She viewed it as something she wanted to control long before it unfolded. Because people who fear the future don't plan for it this meticulously. People who expect the future to be messy do. And the most chilling part? Some say it sounded like she had already considered the possibility of the marriage failing and wanted to pre-write the narrative before the marriage even began. That's pillar one. The second pillar was image. Meghan has always cared about image. Everyone knows that. Friends from her early 20s have said she was hyper-aware of optics, how she dressed, how she spoke, how she presented herself socially and professionally. That isn't unusual. Plenty of actors are like that. But the document reportedly included sections that dealt with how the relationship should be perceived. Not by them, by the public. Guidelines for what they should say if questioned. Guidelines for how they should frame their dynamic. Guidelines for how disagreements should be managed when in the presence of others. Imagine that. A relationship not built on shared intimacy, but on shared optics. Trevor didn't see the problem then. He thought it was part of being in the entertainment world. Part of protecting their careers. Part of being responsible adults. But those who saw the agreement later said it felt chillingly detached, like a media training sheet disguised as romantic partnership. And this leads to the third pillar, the one insiders say Trevor didn't understand until years later. The third pillar was future leverage. This is where everything shifts. According to sources close to the situation, the agreement contained subtle clauses that ultimately gave Meghan more decision-making power if the relationship transitioned, evolved, or dissolved. Not about money, she wasn't rich at the time, but about narrative leverage, about which version of events could be shared publicly, about whose perspective had priority, about who had the right to speak first, about who had the right to shape the story. And this is where Trevor's stomach dropped when he learned the truth. The clauses weren't written as if. They were written as when. Imagine reading those words years later and realizing she wasn't planning for protection. She was planning for separation. Not in a dramatic, villainous way. Not with malice. But with practicality. Cold practicality. Strategic practicality. Professional practicality. That's the part that devastated Trevor. The emotional contradiction between the love he thought they shared and the calculated preparation she allegedly made to cushion herself from the potential fallout of their split. Think about what that means. Really think about it. While Trevor was dreaming of a future, she was protecting herself from it. While Trevor was building a life with her, she was building scaffolding for the version of the story she wanted preserved. While Trevor thought they were planning a marriage, she was preparing for the end of it. Is that cruel? Is that smart? Is that manipulative? Is that self-preservation? Or is it all of the above? That's the emotional storm Trevor reportedly faced when he understood the full meaning of what he had signed. But here's where the story takes a darker, more complicated turn. Because once Meghan left Trevor, once she mailed back the ring in a box, once she moved forward, once she began reinventing herself, that agreement didn't disappear. It activated. People around him say that when Meghan's public persona began evolving, when she began telling certain stories in interviews, when she began reframing her pre-real life, when she began highlighting certain struggles while omitting certain relationships, Trevor realized that the agreement had served its purpose. Not during the marriage. After it. She didn't need it to protect herself from him. She needed it to protect herself from the version of the story he could have shared. And he didn't share it. Not because he wasn't allowed to. Not because the agreement terrified him. Not because he didn't have the right to speak in certain ways. He didn't share it because he didn't want to be part of the circus. He didn't want to drag their past through the mud. He didn't want to present himself as a bitter ex. He didn't want to weaponize the truth, even though Meghan had already shaped her own version of it. But that's the tragedy, isn't it? Silence isn't noble when the truth gets swallowed by someone else's version of events. And that's what hurt the most, the realization that his silence was the very thing Meghan had prepared for. Yet even this wasn't the real bombshell. Because the shocking part, the part that Trevor didn't discover until years later, wasn't the agreement itself. It was something buried inside it. A clause. A single clause. A clause that Meghan allegedly insisted on. A clause Trevor didn't understand at the time. A clause that, according to one insider, made everything make sense in the worst possible way. And that clause? You're not ready for it yet. Because before we get there, we need to talk about what happened next. The reactions of friends, the whispers behind the scenes, the first signals that something was deeply wrong. Because the moment that clause is revealed, everything changes. Have you ever been the last person in the room to realize something was wrong? Truly wrong. The kind of wrong everyone else sees clearly, but you're too close, too hopeful, too emotionally invested to recognize? Because that's the painful truth Trevor Engelson faces when he looks back on those early years. The truth that everyone around him had whispered about long before he ever saw it himself. The truth that his closest friends, colleagues, and even casual Hollywood acquaintances had sensed a shift in Meghan that he refused to acknowledge. And the more you hear these memories, the more obvious it becomes. The agreement wasn't an isolated moment. It was a symptom of something deeper, something baked into the foundation of their relationship, something that people around them saw long before Trevor realized he was living inside a carefully curated emotional performance. Let's rewind to those days. The dinners, the small gatherings, the industry events, the house parties, the late-night talks with friends after long workdays. These were the moments when people first started noticing what they now say were Meghan's earliest signs of emotional distance. Subtle things, quiet things, the kind of details that seem insignificant until they pile up enough to form a pattern. Friends noticed how Meghan always seemed half-present. Physically there, emotionally elsewhere. They noticed how she'd listen intensely to certain conversations and completely tune out others, depending on whether the topic benefited her ambitions. They noticed how she'd ask Trevor about his day, but then pivot quickly to her own goals, her own frustrations, her own plans. It wasn't mean. It wasn't aggressive. It was just strategic. And that's the word people keep using. Strategic. Not loving. Not investing. Not nurturing. Strategic. One friend described it perfectly. You could see her mind working when people talked. Not in a curious way, in a calculating way. She was always deciding who mattered. And in those early days, Trevor mattered. A lot. Not just because she loved him, though friends believe she did, in her own way, but because he was useful, because he was connected, because he believed in her, because he made her feel like she was on the brink of something big. And Meghan, even back then, was always chasing the brink. Another acquaintance from the industry put it like this: Meghan was always leveling up socially. Always. She wasn't mean about it. She wasn't malicious. But you could see her scanning the room, identifying who could help her, who she needed to charm, who she needed to impress. She was climbing even when she pretended she wasn't. That's the part Trevor didn't understand at the time. He saw charm. He saw ambition. He saw a partner working hard to build a future. His friends, on the other hand, saw a woman constantly auditing her environment for opportunities. And the contradiction between these two truths, love versus strategy, sat quietly between them, waiting for the moment it would become too big to ignore. But things got darker when Meghan started gaining more momentum in her career. As she started booking more roles, traveling more often, meeting more industry figures, her emotional dynamic with Trevor began shifting in ways that friends now say felt like watching a script being rewritten in real time. One friend remembers a dinner party where Trevor was excitedly talking about a project he was producing. Meghan was polite at first, smiling, nodding, pretending to engage. But the moment the conversation drifted towards someone who wasn't relevant to her ambitions, she checked out, started looking at her phone, started glancing around the room, started repositioning herself toward people she needed to impress. And when Trevor tried to pull her back into the moment, she responded with a cool, dismissive, "I'm just tired," a line that, according to people who knew her then, became her excuse whenever she didn't want to explain her detachment. Tired became a shield. Tired became a mask. Tired became code for, "This no longer benefits me." And still, Trevor didn't see it. Not clearly. Not consciously. He just thought she was stressed, overworked, focused, driven. He didn't want to believe that the woman he loved might have begun drifting away emotionally, even as they grew closer professionally and socially. But his friends did. They saw it immediately. One friend later said, "It felt like Meghan was transitioning into a new version of herself, and Trevor didn't realize he wasn't part of that version." That's a brutal truth. A truth that only becomes visible in hindsight. A truth that women or men with rising careers sometimes leave behind. A truth Trevor would eventually have to face. But if the subtle emotional distance was the first red flag, the agreement was the second. Because when Meghan presented that document, the people closest to Trevor felt something crack open. A veil lifted. A realization surfaced that Trevor wasn't willing to accept yet. A close friend put it this way: "That's when we knew. Not that she didn't love him, but that she loved herself more." And that's not inherently evil. Many successful people are fiercely self-protective. Many ambitious people prioritize themselves above relationships. Many individuals chase independence so intensely that partnership becomes conditional rather than emotional. But in a marriage, in a partnership, in a union where trust is the foundation, that dynamic is a ticking time bomb. Friends say that after the agreement, something in Trevor shifted. He didn't admit it out loud, but they could see the emotional fog settling in. They could see him trying to reconcile two competing truths: the woman he loved, and the woman who had just asked him to sign something that didn't feel like love at all. And this brings us to what friends now refer to as the big conversation. The moment a group of his closest buddies told him something he never expected to hear. They told him, "She's not building a life with you. She's building a life next to you." Sit with that sentence for a moment. It hits like a punch to the stomach. Because what does it mean to build a life next to someone instead of with them? It means your goals run parallel, not intertwined. It means your plans complement theirs only when convenient. It means your relationship exists as long as it supports a larger strategy, not because the love itself is enough. And that realization, painful as it was, didn't break Trevor. Not then. Not yet. Because love makes you believe you can fix things. Love makes you believe you can outrun the warning signs. Love makes you think you can prove people wrong. So instead of stepping back, Trevor stepped further in. He doubled down. He tried harder. He became more supportive, more helpful, more present. Exactly the opposite of what his friends begged him to do. But here's the tragic part. The more effort Trevor put in, the more Meghan withdrew. And according to insiders, the shift wasn't subtle anymore. It became visible, undeniable, inevitable. Friends started noticing how Meghan spoke to Trevor, not unkind, but increasingly clipped. Increasingly impatient. Increasingly uninterested. Increasingly managerial. As if the romantic connection had been replaced with a professional assessment. They noticed how she began making decisions without him. How she planned her future independently. How she traveled alone more often. How she spent more time in Toronto, more time with castmates, more time cultivating a new social circle that didn't include him. One friend remembers bluntly, "The more successful she became, the less she seemed to need him." That's the line that crushes him in hindsight. That's the line that stings years later. That's the line that makes the agreement suddenly make sense. Because someone who fears losing you doesn't pre-write a breakup agreement. Someone who wants a shared future doesn't plan her exit in advance. Someone who feels secure doesn't need leverage. And someone who is planning to grow beyond you protects herself before she leaves. But if you think this is the moment Trevor realized the truth, it's not. Not yet. He still held on to hope. Still held on to love. Still believed Meghan was overwhelmed, not drifting. Still believed she was stressed, not preparing to walk away. Still believed he could make it work. He didn't know that by the time the agreement was signed, Meghan had already begun rehearsing her next chapter. Because the friends weren't the only ones talking. People in Meghan's world. Assistants, industry contacts, early suits acquaintances were having their own conversations. Conversations Trevor didn't hear. Conversations about how Meghan's rising success had changed the way she viewed relationships. Conversations about how she was starting to reevaluate her future. Conversations about how she once told someone, quietly, privately, "I can't afford to make emotional mistakes right now." Emotional mistakes. Imagine hearing that years later. Imagine realizing you were the mistake she was referring to. Imagine discovering that your love story had an expiration date she knew, but you didn't. But even all of this, all the whispers, all the red flags, all the emotional distance, wasn't the most shocking part. The real shock came later, long after the divorce, when one of Meghan's acquaintances revealed something that made Trevor freeze. Something about the agreement he signed. Something about the missing pages. Something about the clause nobody could explain at the time. A clause that Meghan allegedly insisted on. A clause that seemed unnecessary until she left him. A clause that suddenly made perfect sense once she entered the royal world. The clause that changes everything. And that clause, the one Trevor never understood, is exactly what we're unveiling next. Because when you hear it, you'll understand why Meghan needed it so badly. And why Trevor should have walked away the moment she asked for it. What happens when two people start the race together, but only one of them begins to sprint? That's the emotional pivot point of Trevor and Meghan's story. The moment when everything that seemed solid suddenly felt unstable. The moment when their relationship stopped moving as a partnership and started moving as two separate tracks. Parallel at first, but drifting further apart with every professional milestone Meghan achieved. Because when Meghan landed her role on Suits, the role that became her career-defining launchpad, the dynamic between her and Trevor didn't just shift. It fractured, subtly at first, quietly at first, invisibly at first, but fracture it did, and those cracks widened every month, every callback, every flight, every promotion, every headline. And the cruelest part? Trevor never saw it coming until the distance between them wasn't just emotional. It was physical, geographical, logistical, and irreversible. Let's set the stage. Meghan gets cast on Suits, a major cable drama with a bright future, an exciting ensemble, and a filming location that wasn't Los Angeles, but Toronto. Toronto, thousands of miles away. A city with a completely different rhythm. A city without Trevor. A city where Meghan wasn't Trevor Engelson's partner, but simply Meghan Markle, talented actress, rising star, independent woman ready to reinvent herself. And reinvention is exactly what she did. Toronto became not just her workplace, but her escape, her laboratory, her silo, the place where she began sculpting the version of herself the world would later recognize. Polished, curated, composed, ambitious, selective, brand-conscious, socially aware, and increasingly separate from the world she and Trevor once shared. Imagine the emotional whiplash. One day they're living together, sharing nights, sharing meals, sharing dreams, sharing routines. The next day Meghan is living in a different country for 9 months out of the year, surrounded by new people, new influences, new energy, new opportunities. Distance does not kill relationships by itself, but it magnifies what was already there. And in Meghan's case, the traits her friends once described, ambition, control, strategic thinking, began to intensify. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but naturally, because that's what success does to people. It amplifies their core qualities. It magnifies both their strengths and their shadows. But for Trevor, the contrast was devastating. His life was in Los Angeles. Meetings, pitches, production cycles, industry chaos. Meghan's life was suddenly 2,500 miles away. Scripts, cast dinners, networking events, industry buzz, rising visibility. And for the first time, Trevor wasn't part of her day-to-day world. He wasn't in the rehearsal rooms. He wasn't on set. He wasn't at cast parties. He wasn't in the new atmosphere that shaped every hour of her life. He was supportive, yes. He visited when he could. He called. He cheered her on. But the imbalance was glaring. He was emotionally present in her world, but she was increasingly absent in his. Friends began noticing the difference in their communication. Trevor would call Meghan excited, wanting to share something about his workday, a success, a breakthrough, a story. Meghan would listen. Politely, with that trademark half-smile people talk about, but her responses became shorter, more delayed, more distant. She was distracted, busy, engulfed, not cruel, not dismissive, not rude, just elsewhere. And it wasn't the kind of elsewhere that could be fixed with one good conversation. It was the kind of elsewhere that grows every time you board a plane back to a life your partner isn't part of. One former Suits acquaintance reportedly said, Meghan came alive in Toronto. She had freedom there. She had power there. She had a clean slate. She wasn't anyone's girlfriend or wife. She was the future version of herself. That line says everything. Because what happens when someone begins loving their new life more